Lecture 8, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Metaethics Part 2. 10. Cognitivist and Anti-Realist Theory 1, Moral Error Theory. Thus far, we have seen that cognitivism tends to be associated with realism. However, J.L. Mackie, who made significant contributions to philosophy of religion, language, and metaphysics, breaks from this trend with his moral error theory. Mackie seems to argue that moral claims are beliefs of moral facts of the world, but he is anti-realist in that he claims that moral facts do not actually exist in the world. In Mackie's own words, although most people in making moral judgments implicitly claim, among other things, to be pointing to something objectively prescriptive, these claims are all false. By prescriptive, Mackie means action guiding, and Mackie denies that any objective guides to action, moral properties, in our text's terms, actually exist. Mackie's argument from relativity is built out of his appreciation for the depth of moral disagreement, and so shares something with one of the objections to intuitionism offered in the previous section. Mackie points out that in the sciences and historical studies, as evidence is gathered over time, disagreements on particular issues tend to fade. However, as Mackie also points out, in ethics, a lot of the same problems that philosophers have been arguing about for 2,000 years remain unsolved. So, Mackie thinks that if there were answers to these questions, we would have found some of them by now. This leads Mackie to reject realism. Argument queerness. Mackie's second anti-realist argument is also his most famous. The argument from queerness is a metaethical objection in that it digs into the underlying justifications for the function of moral reasoning itself. Morality is, of course, supposed to be action guiding, that is, when we learn that something is immoral, then we ought not to do it. But here again is the so-called is-ought gap, identified by Hume. If you recall from Lecture 1, this is a fallacy that supposes conditional statements of the form, if something is some way, then it ought to be some way. However, moving from an is to an ought doesn't seem to work on its own. The example I gave in Lecture 1 was very unpleasant, framed here as a conditional statement. It would read, if Hitler is killing millions, then Hitler ought to be killing millions. It seems obvious to me that this does not follow, but what seems less obvious is whether this next argument is incorrect, namely, if this tree is growing, then we ought not to cut it down. Of course, this argument would also fail if we had a good reason to cut it down, but if we accept that moving from an is to an ought works in one instance, what exactly is the reason that we should not accept that it doesn't work in the previous instance? If your answer is that the Hitler example is immoral and the tree example is moral, then you are arguing that, if something is moral, then we ought to do it, and if something is immoral, then we ought not to do it. Now, of course, this reasoning is guilty of the same fallacy, and perhaps even guilty of the additional fallacy of circular reasoning or begging the question as we discussed earlier. Mackie refers to this as queer since he is using the term in the lexical sense, namely, referring to something as strange or odd. His use has nothing to do with how we currently conceive of the term nor any derogatory connotations. Indeed, we could easily use the terms strange or odd with no loss in accuracy. Since, as Mackie points out, we only see this is-ought connection in moral reasoning, that would mean that anything moral would possess very strange properties, indeed, drastically different properties or features of properties from anything else. Mackie suggests that it is better to accept that there are no properties with unique metaphysical and epistemological features that make those properties different from anything else. As said before, Hume was the first to identify the problem of the is-ought gap. According to Hume, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning, and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought, or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. Hume is pointing out how strange it is that, in moral claims of what is the case, we somehow arrive at what ought to be, while in any other circumstance or mode of reasoning, there is no way to derive an ought from an is. As our text says, Hume has his own suggestion for explanation, and this is outlined in section 12. Mackie, however, takes this Humean worry in his own direction. Mackie suggests that properties themselves that carry such an action-guiding quality, that offer an ought just because they are, would be extremely queer properties. He says that, if there were objective values, moral properties, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. Using Occam's razor, Mackie suggests that it is more reasonable to suppose that there is no difference between moral reasoning or the properties of the world we point to in our moral decision-making and all other forms of reasoning and the properties of the world that we point to in all other forms of decision-making. Indeed, as our text says, support for anti-realism through a complaint about the queerness of moral properties is further supported via consideration of Hume's fork. Hume divided knowledge into two camps: knowledge gained from relations of ideas and knowledge gained from matters of fact. Knowledge claims like 2 + 2 = 4, or various geometric claims like triangles have 3 sides, are established in the former way, whereas knowledge claims like Alistair is wearing a blue shirt today are established in the latter way. This split of types of knowledge is referred to as Hume's fork. However, claims to moral knowledge do not fit either side of the fork. Moral knowledge is not derivable simply from relations of ideas, like mathematical truth, and it cannot be deduced a priori without any sense experience in the real world. Furthermore, it does not seem to fit with matter-of-fact types of knowledge either, given the is-ought gap. A posteriori, sense-based, worldly, and scientific empirical observations reveal what is, not what ought to be. If moral knowledge does not fit into either side of Hume's fork, then it will be the case that either moral knowledge is a completely unique type of knowledge accessed in a completely unique way, or, more plausibly perhaps, moral knowledge does not actually exist. But if we cannot know that moral properties exist, then we should not be realists. Therefore, since moral knowledge doesn't fit in with relations of ideas or matters of fact, it must either be a unique type of knowledge, arrived at in a unique way, which would be very strange, queer as Mackie puts it, or the simpler answer is true, namely, moral knowledge does not exist. On a weaker reading, this shows that we cannot know for certain whether moral properties exist, so we ought to be, at least, skeptical of realism. 11. Objections to moral error theory. The realist theorists, as it says in our text, may not be swayed by Mackie's arguments against realism. Intuitionists might not have a problem with moral reasoning being strange as Mackie does. They may admit that it is strange that moral reasoning is the only form of reasoning that can bridge the is-ought gap, but they may not believe that is a problem. After all, on the intuitionists' account, moral properties are unique in virtue of their irreducible simplicity. Naturalists, likewise, may not be swayed by Mackie's argument either, since everything is different from everything else to at least some degree. Furthermore, as noted in Lecture 1, it doesn't follow from the fact that people disagree on something, that there is no correct answer. Jaya, for example, tried to explain away Mackie's concern, claiming that moral disagreements existed only where there were disagreements over the non-moral facts. On this view, Jack and Jill disagree over the morality of abortion only because they disagree over the empirical fact of whether the fetus experiences any pain or suffering in the process. If all the non-moral facts were clear, then their disagreement would no longer persist. Thus, Jaya would have felt that moral disagreement is not as deep and pervasive as Mackie suggests. A different response to moral disagreement is to defend the idea of moral progress. Our text suggests that it may be tempting to argue that moral disagreement has actually reduced over time because we have come into contact with truths regarding the badness of slavery, sexism, and racism, etc. For example, moral error theory denies the possibility of moral progress in virtue of denying any moral truth. Progress requires correct answers. If you believe that progress has been made in ethics, perhaps in the form of human rights being identified, then you have a reason to disagree with moral error theory. As a matter of fact, progress has been made. For example, Vermont was the first sovereign state to abolish slavery, and numerous other Western countries followed suit in the years following. Interestingly, Western countries were apparently the first in the world to legally ban slavery, and yet they are consistently condemned for a practice that predated them. The establishment of international human rights laws serve as a further example of potential moral progress, which mandates countries preserve and protect freedom from discrimination, right to equality between men and women, right to life, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, among other moral ideals. Moral error theory is also highly counterintuitive. The claim that every moral idea is wrong is at least striking, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. 12. Non-cognitivism, yet another theory from within the Humean landscape. Non-cognitivism is the position that moral claims are not merely cognitive beliefs, they are a combination of factual beliefs accompanied by moral attitudes, feelings, or desires. While a cognitivist might believe the statement, abortion is morally wrong, is a single cognitive belief and a single moral claim, a non-cognitivist might say that the first half of the claim, namely, abortion is a factual claim and the second half, morally wrong, is a moral feeling. Thus, giving moral claims the appearance of bridging the is-ought gap, when in actuality, moral claims communicate two different things, 1, a statement of fact and, 2, a statement of one's feelings regarding that fact. 13. Non-cognitivist and anti-realist theory 1, emotivism. Our text identifies A. J. Eyre and C. L. Stevenson as defenders of the metaethical theory of emotivism. Also referred to as the Bouhara theory, emotivism basically claims that moral statements merely communicate our positive and negative feelings about actions. When we claim that something is morally wrong, we boo it, and when we claim something is morally right, we hurrah in favor of it. These emotional reactions are supposed to explain the connection between morality and motivation to act. Therefore, our moral claims retain meaning on this view, unlike Mackey's, but the claims have only emotive meaning. 14. Objections to emotivism. Our text outlines 3 objections to emotivism. The first objection is that, in making moral claims, we often do take ourselves to be making claims about how we perceive the world to be and not merely expressing an emotion. The second objection is that, though moral claims are often emotionally charged, they are not always, and in those situations, emotivism is silent as a metaethical theory. The possibility of moral beliefs regarding tax evasion is examined as an example of non-emotional morality. The third objection returns to moral disagreement in that, when we argue or discuss morality, as we are here in this lecture, we don't appear to be merely emotionally booing or hurrahing, but carefully and logically working through moral problems and theories. While none of these objections are decisively damning for emotivism, emotivism has declined in popularity as a result of them. Our text's comparison of emotivism to relativism is more interesting and complex, thus deserving more analysis and elucidation. Indeed, according to our text, emotivism may seem like moral relativism, but it is not identical with relativism. To point out the subtle differences, our text gives the example of cultural relativism, in which claims of morality can factually be true or false so long as they accurately correspond to that culture's accepted morality. This makes cultural relativism a realist theory unlike emotivism, which is anti-realist. Therefore, as long as my culture holds that the claim, murder is wrong, is true, then my agreement or disagreement will be true or false, making it a realist, though relativistic, theory. 15. Non-cognitive and anti-realist theory 2, prescriptivism. Our text cites R.M. Hare as a committed non-cognitivist and anti-realist whose metaethical theory seemed to be a more promising version of emotivism. Hare made a very common-sense addition to emotivism in that, he believed our moral claims intrinsically communicate subjective prescriptions for others to act in accordance with our moral judgments. This is an intuitive addition since our moral judgments don't feel as though we are merely approving or disapproving when we make them. Hence, why his theory is referred to as prescriptivism. 16. Objections to prescriptivism. Even though prescriptivism is a step up from emotivism, it is still open to many of the same objections raised against emotivism. As our text says, even though prescriptivism can address moral disagreements better than emotivism could, it only provides the tools to call someone out on the grounds of inconsistency. Our text gives the example of someone who claims that murder is always wrong but then endorses the murder of a cruel dictator. A prescriptivist claims that in such situations we can indeed criticize other moral theories and engage in moral disagreements because, unlike feelings, incompatible prescriptions are logically arguable. However, again, this only gives us the ability to denounce another's view on grounds of inconsistency. If we were to encounter a sexist or racist moral view that was deplorable but entirely consistent on prescriptivism, we have no grounds to suggest it is incorrect. As our text says, this would be indeed troubling, but a prescriptivist would likely respond that, just because we don't like it, it doesn't mean it isn't true. However, this is a judgment we must make for ourselves after reflection. 17. Summary. As our text says, there is much more that could be said in this chapter. Metaethical theories are as varied and nuanced as their normative rivals, and it is impossible to give a fair hearing to all of them in a single chapter. Catherine Wilson has authored an inquiry into metaethics that reflects the challenge of coming to your own, first-person, view on these issues. However, we have tried as far as possible on this whistle-stop tour to outline these theories clearly and to give them such a fair hearing. It is for you to decide where you sit in the debate between cognitivism and non-cognitivism, realism and anti-realism, and, more generally, to decide how much importance metaethics has relative to the normative and applied camps of ethical study. 18. Questions and tasks. While our text asks 13 questions, please be sure to answer these before next time. 1. Can you give another example of an open question argument with a different candidate natural moral property? 2. Is there such a thing as moral progress? What does this suggest in terms of metaethics? 3. Can a non-cognitivist properly explain moral disagreement? 4. What is the Humean account of motivation? Why does it support non-cognitivism?